Well, Nigel Biggar is an academic thinker who's invested more time than most working through the ethics of colonisation, and he brings a degree of clarity to the issue that we desperately need in this country right now. I read his new book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, over the summer, and I was struck with his historical rigour, the nuance, and his bravery in tackling issues from which others would shrink. Biggar is not a historian. He's an Anglican priest, theologian and ethicist who's held positions as Professor of Theology and Ethics at the University of Leeds and Trinity College Dublin. Most recently, he was Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford until his retirement last year. He joins me now from Oxford. Nigel, thank you for your book, Colonialism. It's a reckoning. It's somewhat, you adopt a somewhat unfashionable position, if I can say that, in that you refuse to condemn colonialism outright, but neither do you claim that it's always and everywhere a good thing. I suspect that the nuance in your arguments would be lost on your critics, am I right?
Yeah, so it seems, Nick. I mean, I wrote the book because I knew enough about British imperial and colonial history to know that the story currently being put about in my country, probably yours, is that British colonialism was nothing but a litany of racism and economic exploitation and cultural suppression. And I knew enough, as I said, to know that that story just is not true. I mean, yes, there were elements of all of those involved, but also the very positive elements too. So my position is, by all means, let's tell the truth, but let's tell the whole truth.
Of course, it's a difficult ground, and you begin your book by describing an early brush with cancel culture and the cultural and academic intolerance that you arrived into when you started making some arguments about Cecil Rhodes in 2017 at a time when the mob was out to tear down his statue. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, so you're right. In 2016, in fact, I began to make known my opposition to the tearing down of Rhodes's statue. And then in 2017, I and a very eminent historian of empire, John Darwin, launched a project called Ethics and Empire, designed to look at how people from ancient China to the modern period have regarded empire morally in their own time. And then late in November 17, I published an article in the London Times in which I made what I thought was the completely anodyne, incontrovertible claim that we British, and by extension Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, we can find cause for both pride and shame in our colonial past. I mean, both, not just shame, also pride. And that provoked an academic at Cambridge University, Dr. Prema Gopal, to launch a campaign to use her words, to shut down my Ethics and Empire project.
Whenever we hear this word, the suffix ism added to a word, I always suspect there's some intellectual skullduggery at work, Nigel. The attempt to turn something complex and multifaceted into a single unbending ideological force. So what are we to make of the term colonialism? Is there such a thing?
Yes, Nick, like you, I try and avoid talking about imperialism or colonialism because it connotes, as it were, a single unitary project, as if someone woke up in London one sunny day in, let's say, 1600 and said, "Oh, let's go and conquer the world." It was never like that. Empires are seldom like that. Maybe Nazi Germany was like that when Hitler decided to go and conquer Europe. But usually it's not like that. The British colonial phenomena were many, and they differed over time, and they differed from Newfoundland to New Zealand. So my view is, I think it's best to avoid talking about colonialism. There was no project. The empire was about all manner of things, from trade to humanitarian endeavor to gaining geopolitical advantage, all manner of things. And to talk about colonialism implies a unity and coherence that just wasn't there.
And I think you can see it when you look at Australia. It's a very different type of exercise, the settlement in Australia, than earlier colonies. We like to think of it as an Enlightenment settlement. It was motivated and driven by men of science, people of the Enlightenment who had some quite high ideals. But of course, in Australia, as in Canada, as in New Zealand and the United States, where free settlers find themselves in conflict with the indigenous inhabitants from the beginning, there's always going to be issues. And you write this: when the people of one culture meet another and dominated in number and power, only three outcomes are possible. Either the dominant people annihilate the dominant one, or the latter adopts and assimilates, or the two people separate. And you say that in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or Australia, or South Africa, the imperial policy was assimilation. The belief that native peoples were essentially equal to Britons and possessed the potential to become equally civilised was the predominant sentiment in the imperial metropolis, even when some settlers on the colonial periphery doubted it. Well, that word assimilation, I know what you mean, and I understand it, and I understand the concept, but it has bad connotations for some these days. Can you explain a little bit further what you do and what you don't mean by assimilation?
Yeah, well, let's go back to the three options I laid out: annihilation, separation, or what we might call apartheid, and assimilation. British colonial government policy and imperial policy was never annihilation. In my view, there was never anything approaching an intentional genocide, not even in Tasmania. And some Australian historians standing to my left, like Henry Reynolds, would agree with that. There were occasionally there were policies of temporary separation, the creation of reserves for native peoples in North America, for example, the purpose of which was to protect Aboriginal peoples, native peoples, from conflict with settlers, so that they could gradually learn to adapt to a new way of life that was coming, in particular agriculture, learn English, so that they could then play an unequal part in the emerging Europeanized society. So yes, it is important to note that in 1853, Black Africans were granted the vote in the same terms as whites, long before blacks were granted the vote in America. And in 1867, I think they were granted, Maori were granted the rights in the same terms as whites in New Zealand, and 1885 in Canada. Now, it didn't always work out as well as we would have liked, because in Canada, for example, the Liberal Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, 10 years after the vote was granted, Native Canadians in Eastern Canada revoked the vote. Why? Because the natives were all voting Tory. So it wasn't a clear upward trajectory into the sunlit uplands of progress. There were ups and downs, but the idea was the liberal idea, the humanitarian idea was, and indeed the Christian idea, that native peoples may well be, relatively speaking, underdeveloped, but that native peoples, in principle, are equally capable of being as developed and as civilized as white people. And so the idea was to assimilate them into a new common society on equal terms as equal citizens.
Yeah, and that's quite a far-sighted idea, isn't it? I mean, compared to what's happening in the rest of the world in that period, and certainly, going through that period in the late 19th and early 20th century, when the idea of eugenics reigned, the idea that some races of people were somehow inferior. The idea that Aboriginal people in Australia had equal ability and to thrive has stuck pretty well, hasn't it? And from day one, there was protection under the law for Aboriginals. Over time, they become fully integrated as citizens with the rights and the duties to vote and so on. My difficulty with the voice to Parliament, which is this proposal that's here at the moment, we'll be voting on this later in the year. Do we want a separate Indigenous voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution? My difficulty with that is that it disrupts the balance by giving special rights to Indigenous people, not just to help them catch up on, basic measures like education and health, which of course we'd support, but in perpetuity by making this new body part of the Constitution. That to me is separatism, it seems to me, as you described it in your three options, and it's a fundamental shift from the notion that we're all equal as citizens holding an identical state in our shared national inheritance.
Yes, Nick. I mean, you know more about that debate than I do here in Britain, but I agree with. I share your reservation in that the danger is that this actually exacerbates racial antagonism by privileging one people over. I mean, Australia comprises people from all sorts of ethnic backgrounds now. By privileging one people. And also, I take it is the case that Aboriginal Australians already have representation through the normal means of parliamentary elections.
They do, Nigel. They do, Nigel. In fact, there's 11 Aboriginal representatives, either MPs or senators right now, which is higher as a percentage than the 3.6 of the general population, 6% of the general population that are Aboriginal. So they do have not just one voice, but 11 voices. So it is an extra on top of that.
I mean, there are various ways in which a single state can accommodate a measure, let's say, of cultural autonomy. So in Britain here, which is a multinational state, as you well know, comprising English, Scots, Welsh and Irish, Welsh language has been revived within the British state, largely through public funding for some time now, and many people in Wales speak both English and Welsh. So it's possible for a single state to support Aboriginal culture, but giving Aboriginal folk, as it were, a separate and privileged political voice is, I think, is a dangerous step for the reason I've suggested.
Well, let me test this out with you, because I think I found that your three options, basically assimilation or equal citizenship, as we might call it, the eradication of one race over another or one group over another, or the separate development of the two, and I hesitate to use that word apartheid because it's so loaded, but of course that's what it means in literal terms. This is very useful to understand where we are now. So if that movement for the voice is a move, as I see it, towards separatism, there's something else happening. It's being pushed one step further with the claim of Aboriginal sovereignty. To explain what I mean, let's have a listen to a speech in the Australian Senate this week from Aboriginal Senator Lydia Thorpe.
This is a colonial institution with colonial laws. I'm here to infiltrate it, to rattle the cages, to destroy the white supremacy that is represented in this place. The Constitution is an illegal document. It's illegal. We will never cede our sovereignty, and we'll fight you to the end for a treaty so that we have real power in this country. So look out.
Pretty aggressive statement there from Lydia Thorpe, even for Lydia, and quite a radical one. But I think she does cross the line still further, Nigel. She seems to want to go back and revisit the legitimacy of Australian settlement by the British at all, and to say basically we have no place in this country and we need to cede sovereignty to the Aboriginal people. That's a pretty radical form, and I don't see that ending nicely, do you?
No, and I'm thinking of the example of Canada, where when First Nations peoples have demanded and got all sorts of special rights, particularly over certain territories. And from what I've read, Nick, within the territories or reserves of Native peoples in Canada, Native peoples often do not flourish because of corruption, precisely because they are cut off from wider Western urbanized, Europeanized society. So there's a danger here of creating, as it were, enclaves or ghettos of native folk who are disadvantaged precisely because they are separated. It all depends on what sovereignty means, but it seems to me to be highly dangerous to compromise the notion of a common citizenship, a common investment in Australia. Of course, as I said, there can be policies which support Aboriginal culture, but to establish a kind of political separation and apartheid within the state, I think is very dangerous. And also, I take it there, as in Canada, there are lots of people who have Aboriginal blood who are thoroughly integrated into Westernized society, and the question arises: well, who does the likes of Lydia represent exactly? Because it seems to me they're highly likely she doesn't represent all Aboriginal people. So who's she speaking for, and who would these sovereign nations comprise? But I do think while a unitary state can accommodate a measure of cultural autonomy, for example, in the UK, Scotland has had its own legal system, its own church, its own educational system ever since the Union. I think this needs to be subordinated to a unitary, cohesive state. Otherwise, you have uncontrollable tensions and conflicts.
Yeah, indeed. The question of who qualifies as an Indigenous person, up to now, it didn't really matter too much if people wanted. I mean, Lydia Thorpe, for instance, she's partly Irish, partly English, and partly Aboriginal. Now, if she wanted to identify as an Aboriginal person, then that's fine. You know, I mean, I'm English and Scottish, I can choose, but I actually decide I'm an Australian, and that solves the problem. But the point is, it does become an issue when you start to grant special rights in the form of a new voice to Parliament and so forth. And when it comes to reparations, and I want to explore this now because I think the way you deal with this question, the question of reparations, helps unpack some of these moral complexities. They're being discussed actively by the Queensland government right now, and there is at least one prominent advocate for the voice to Parliament who says it will lead on to white Australians having to pay the rent for living on Aboriginal land. Now, deciding who gets what and how much and who pays what to whom gets a little hard, doesn't it, when we delve into history? You quote from a letter published in the Times some years ago in which a former diplomat recounts a conversation he had with a Nigerian ruler who was demanding compensation for colonial oppression. And after listening intently, the diplomat replied, "I entirely agree, and you shall have your compensation, just as soon as we get ours from the Romans." It's not an easy one to sort out, is it?
No, I really think we should focus on trying to address unjust disadvantages in the present, rather than which have been caused by all manner of thing, rather than trying to sort out the injustices of a certain period of the past, let's say 200 years ago, because the descendants of victims 200 years ago are not the victims. My people were Scots, and in the 1600s they were on the wrong side of the Scottish government. They fought battles they lost. They were hounded into the Scottish hills. Do I feel their pain? Don't be absurd. My position is not theirs, thank God. Trying to determine who did wrong to whom and what's now owed, given what happened 200 years ago, just doesn't make sense. Apart from anything else, all peoples in Australia, including Aboriginals, now have the benefits of a highly prosperous, a very liberal society in which there is a welfare state, which didn't exist 200 years ago. So in many respects, the descendants of unjustly treated Aboriginals are far, far better off than their ancestors. So I think it really doesn't make sense to try and, as it were, freeze history to a certain point and say, well, so-and-so was unjustly treated. We need to make reparation for that then. I mean, I take it also that, as in North America, native peoples were quite accustomed to pushing each other off the land. The question is, why focus on white settlers who pushed X people off land when another Aboriginal people some 100 years before had pushed them off the land? I mean, you can't, as it were, unravel the knots of history in that way. By all means, let's address present disadvantage, but unless we have a case that's very similar to that of the looting of Jewish property by Nazis, and then you have a immediately subsequent German state that compensates the relatives of those Jews who were robbed. That's a case where the identity of the perpetrator is clear, the identity of those who are owed compensation is clear, and the identity of the subsequent state is clear. That's all relatively rational. But when you try and go back 200 years to sort out history, I think it's not rational.
Well, with a lot we could have got to, but we're running out of time. I mean, in your book, you talk a lot about slavery and the arguments around that. I'd like maybe to have a chance to revisit that with you at a future moment. But just very quickly,
sure.
Since you mentioned the question of Nazi Germany, do you think that the anti-colonialists undermine their arguments by jumping to judgment with words like genocide, for instance, which, as you rightly point out, I think was not a feature of Australian society, because it immediately puts those sins and evils, whatever they were, on a par with probably the greatest evil in modern history, the extermination of the Jews and so forth. Do we perhaps need to encourage them to moderate their language and be more accurate in what their criticisms are?
The reason they do that, Nick, is that, the British Empire and Australia, like any state, over time contains both evils and goods, right? We've heard about the evils, the unjust treatment of Aboriginals. But look, Australia quickly became one of the most prosperous countries in the world before the end of the 1800s, and is now one of the most prosperous and liberal countries in the world to live in, right? So there were achievements as well as failures. But the reason the anti-colonialists want to equate British colonialism with Nazism, with Auschwitz and genocide, and saying that Churchill was equivalent to Hitler, is because we all know that some states are so centrally evil that it doesn't matter how many bridges they built or whether they made the trains run on time. That doesn't compensate for the evils of Auschwitz. So that's why the anti-colonialists try and equate British colonialism with Nazism. And as you say, genocide is one way of doing that. And the problem with the word genocide is it's so broadly defined. It needs to be an intentional act of systemic annihilation of a people, and that never happened in Australia, to my knowledge.
Indeed, Nigel. Thank you very much. Just your book, Colonialism: A Moral Reckoning, is published by William Collins Books, an imprint of HarperCollins. Thank you very much for joining us today on Battleground.
Great to talk. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.